We live in a time where information is everywhere, yet genuine thinking is becoming rare. It almost feels like the more knowledge surrounds us, the less willing we are to truly question it. Ignorance in this age does not always mean a lack of access to facts. Instead, it often shows up as a refusal to look deeper, a comfort in not asking why, and a fear of challenging what feels safe or familiar. This quiet surrender of the mind is what gives rise to something far more dangerous: idolatry. Not the ancient image of worshipping statues, but the modern reality of blindly following people, ideas, and systems without question. Think about how easy it has become to accept whatever flashes across our screens. News headlines are read as if they are complete truth, celebrity opinions are treated as wisdom, and political slogans replace thoughtful debate. It is not that people are incapable of thinking. It is that they have traded critical thought for convenience and belonging. To question the group feels risky. To doubt the accepted narrative can invite ridicule or even anger. And so, little by little, critical thinking weakens, replaced by loyalty to idols of ideology, fame, or authority. This is the strange irony of our age. Surrounded by endless information, we often become more ignorant, not less. We scroll endlessly, consume endlessly, yet rarely pause to ask, is this true? Who benefits if I believe this? What evidence supports it? Ignorance grows when we stop caring about the answers to these questions, and idolatry thrives when people are eager to surrender their judgment to someone or something else. The death of critical thinking is not sudden. It creeps in silently, disguised as entertainment, as convenience, as trust in authority. It convinces us that questioning is unnecessary, that comfort is better than truth, that belonging is safer than honesty. But beneath this comfort lies a dangerous weakness. When we give up the habit of questioning, we give up freedom itself. We allow others to decide what is real, what is important, and even what is worth living for. And so the question arises, have we become worshippers of idols we do not even see? The idol of approval, the idol of ideology, the idol of certainty. Or do we still have the courage to think for ourselves, even when the answers make us uncomfortable? Ignorance is often misunderstood as simply not knowing, but in reality, it is much deeper than that. A person can have libraries of information at their fingertips and still remain ignorant if they refuse to question or reflect. True ignorance is the deliberate avoidance of truth, the unwillingness to confront ideas that may disrupt comfort or belonging. It is when people choose silence over curiosity, conformity over exploration. In today's world, this type of ignorance is not only common, it is rewarded. Social media feeds us what we already agree with. Search engines give us results shaped by our preferences. And communities encourage loyalty to group beliefs rather than independent thought. Idolatry grows naturally in such an environment. Humans have always sought leaders, symbols and ideals to follow, but when critical thinking dies, these figures transform into idols. Idolatry today does not always look like worshipping ancient gods. It can be the unquestioned devotion to celebrities, influencers, political leaders, or even abstract ideas. A person can worship money, power, or fame without ever calling it worship. What makes it idolatry is the blind surrender of judgment, the unwillingness to see flaws, and the habit of excusing contradictions. When people stop questioning the values they live by, they hand over control of their lives to forces that do not always have their best interests at heart. The death of critical thinking begins early. From childhood, many are taught to obey rather than to question. Schools often reward memorization instead of curiosity, conformity instead of creativity. Children quickly learn that asking too many questions can be seen as disruptive, that doubt is unwelcome, and that the safe path is to agree with authority. By the time they reach adulthood, many no longer recognize the habit of questioning as natural. Instead, they repeat inherited beliefs, follow trends, and shape their lives around approval. This slow erosion of independent thought is the soil in which ignorance and idolatry thrive. The consequences of this are not small. On a personal level, it leads to poor decision-making, since choices are made based on what others expect rather than what is true or wise. People end up in careers they do not love, relationships that do not serve them, and lifestyles that feel empty, all because they never paused to ask the difficult questions. On a social level, the cost is even greater. When entire communities stop thinking critically, manipulation becomes easy. Leaders can twist truth, corporations can sell illusions, and ideologies can take root without resistance. Societies that silence questions eventually lose the ability to correct themselves, stumbling blindly into cycles of corruption, division, and decline. But ignorance and idolatry do not only harm society at large, they also harm the inner life of the individual. A mind that does not think deeply becomes restless. Anxiety grows when people sense that something is wrong but cannot name it. Anger rises when ideas are challenged because the person has never learned to explore doubt calmly. Dependence on idols, whether leaders, celebrities, or ideologies, creates a fragile sense of self. When the idol is criticized or exposed, the believer feels personally attacked because their own identity has been built on borrowed beliefs. This is why debates today so often turn bitter. People are not only defending opinions, they are defending their sense of self, which has become tied to idols instead of rooted in truth. And yet, despite how bleak this picture may seem, there is always the possibility of renewal. Critical thinking is not something that disappears forever. It sleeps within every mind, waiting to be awakened. The first step is awareness, the courage to admit that one has perhaps accepted too much without question. The second step is curiosity, the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, even if the answers shake old beliefs. Finally, there is the step of practice, learning to examine information, to seek evidence, to listen without blind loyalty, and to stand firm in truth, even when it is unpopular. These steps may not be easy, but they are the path out of ignorance and away from idolatry. The choice is always present: remain comfortable in the crowd or dare to think alone. One path offers safety but keeps the mind asleep. The other path may feel uncertain, but it leads to freedom. Critical thinking demands courage, but it also offers the reward of clarity, strength, and authenticity. And in an age drowning in noise and idols, those who choose to think may become the rare voices that keep truth alive. Idolatry in the modern world wears many disguises, and most of the time people do not even realize they are practicing it. It is not always a golden statue or a sacred figure standing on an altar. Today, it can be a politician whose words are accepted without evidence, a celebrity whose lifestyle is copied without reflection, or even a social media influencer whose opinions are treated as ultimate truth. People begin to shape their choices, their identities, and even their values around these idols. The tragedy is not in admiring someone, but in surrendering independent judgment to them. When people stop questioning, they stop growing, and when they stop growing, they slowly lose their freedom. Social media has magnified this tendency. The constant flood of opinions, likes, and trends creates an environment where being popular often matters more than being right. An idea repeated enough times begins to look like truth, even if no evidence supports it. Followers defend influencers passionately, often without knowing much about their lives beyond the surface. Political parties turn into tribes where loyalty becomes more important than honesty. Entire communities split into camps, each treating their chosen figures as untouchable, while mocking or hating the other side. In this environment, critical thinking feels like a threat because it can disturb the illusion of certainty that idols provide. Education, too, has played a role in weakening the spirit of inquiry. When success is measured by test scores and memorization, students learn that knowledge is about storing information rather than exploring it. The ability to repeat what has already been said is rewarded, while the courage to ask why or what if is often discouraged. By the time these students enter society, many have lost the habit of questioning. They enter workplaces where efficiency is valued more than creativity, and communities where conformity keeps the peace. Without realizing it, they slip into patterns of thought where it feels easier to follow than to examine, easier to worship than to challenge. The effect of idolatry and ignorance on society is visible everywhere. When people accept information without reflection, misinformation spreads faster than truth. Conspiracy theories gain power not because they are convincing, but because they are repeated by trusted voices. Entire groups may rally around an idea that has no basis in reality, and because questioning is rare, the illusion survives. In such a world, those who try to think critically often feel isolated. They may be labeled negative, arrogant, or rebellious simply for asking questions. This social pressure keeps many silent, and silence is the oxygen that allows ignorance and idolatry to breathe. On a personal level, the cost of blind devotion is heavy. Idols cannot carry the weight of human hope forever. Politicians fall, celebrities make mistakes, movements collapse, and ideas are proven false. When the idol breaks, the followers are left empty, angry, or lost. They may rush to find a new idol, or they may sink into despair, unable to rebuild an identity that was never truly their own. A person who never learns to think independently remains trapped in a cycle of dependence, always looking for the next voice to follow, the next figure to trust blindly. This is why critical thinking is not just a skill, but a survival tool for the mind. Yet it is not enough to only point out the problem. The path forward requires courage and discipline. Ignorance and idolatry thrive on passivity, while critical thinking requires active effort. It means slowing down before accepting information, searching for evidence before forming opinions, and being willing to stand apart from the crowd when necessary. It requires humility too, because true thinking is not about proving oneself right, but about seeking what is true, even if it means admitting past mistakes. The person who values truth over loyalty, evidence over authority, and honesty over comfort is the one who resists the pull of idolatry. In a culture that celebrates speed, distraction, and conformity, choosing to think deeply can feel almost radical. But history shows that progress has always depended on those willing to question idols and confront ignorance. Every great movement for justice, every scientific discovery, every meaningful work of art has come from minds that refuse to worship the common illusions of their time. The question for us today is whether we are willing to do the same. Will we continue to trade freedom of thought for the comfort of belonging? Or will we step away from the idols that demand our loyalty and reclaim the courage to think for ourselves? The answer to that question will shape not only our individual lives, but the future of our entire society. The slow death of critical thinking does not happen in a dramatic collapse, but in small, almost invisible steps. People rarely wake up one day and decide to stop questioning the world around them. Instead, it begins with the little compromises made each day. A student who once loved asking questions learns that silence earns better grades. An employee who notices flaws in a company's system decides it is safer not to speak up. A citizen who feels uneasy about a leader's decisions chooses not to voice concerns because everyone else seems supportive. Bit by bit, the mind gets trained to obey instead of analyze, to follow instead of challenge. What is lost in the process is not just independent thought, but the very courage to think. The structures of modern society reinforce this decline. Education often trains people to memorize answers rather than explore ideas. Workplaces value obedience, loyalty, and efficiency more than creativity or innovation. Social media rewards the loudest voices, not the most thoughtful ones. News networks focus on speed instead of accuracy, leaving viewers informed but not enlightened. Each of these forces contributes to a culture where reflection feels unnecessary, even burdensome. As a result, ignorance is no longer simply an accident. It becomes a habit, a way of life. Fear also plays a major role. People worry about the consequences of questioning what others take for granted. They fear being labeled troublemakers, outcasts, or pessimists. In communities bound tightly by tradition, religion, or ideology, questioning can even bring shame or punishment. This fear silences individuals before they even attempt to think critically. To avoid conflict, many choose to keep their doubts private, or worse, they bury them altogether. Over time, the ability to doubt erodes, replaced by an instinctive submission to authority or the crowd. The influence of technology has made the problem sharper. Algorithms are designed to keep people engaged by showing them what they already like, not what might challenge their views. This creates echo chambers where the same ideas circulate endlessly, reinforcing biases and shielding individuals from alternative perspectives. In such spaces, thinking critically feels almost unnatural because the environment is designed to prevent discomfort. Ignorance thrives in these comfortable loops of familiar information, and idols grow stronger as their voices echo without opposition. The cultural emphasis on speed also weakens thoughtful reflection. In a world where every second brings new updates, breaking news, or viral trends, pausing to analyze feels like falling behind. People skim instead of reading, react instead of reflecting, and share instead of questioning. The pace of life leaves little room for depth, and when depth disappears, so does critical thought. What is left is a society that consumes information like fast food, quick, easy, and often unhealthy. The cost of this decline is visible everywhere. Poor decisions are made not because people lack intelligence, but because they lack the patience to think. Leaders exploit public ignorance by offering slogans instead of solutions. Corporations profit from shallow desires by selling illusions of happiness. Communities become divided because loyalty to idols replaces dialogue and reason. In such a climate, truth becomes fragile, easily buried under noise and manipulation. Yet the responsibility does not lie only with systems or leaders. It also lies with individuals. Each person has a choice whether to nurture or neglect the habit of questioning. Critical thinking cannot survive in a culture where everyone waits for someone else to do the work of thinking. It must be practiced daily, by asking why before accepting, by comparing evidence before believing, by listening carefully before judging. Even small acts of reflection build the strength needed to resist ignorance and idolatry. Ultimately, the death of critical thinking is not only about the loss of a skill, it is about the loss of freedom. When people stop thinking for themselves, they allow others to think for them. They surrender control over their choices, their values, and even their understanding of reality. This surrender may feel safe in the moment, but it leaves society vulnerable to manipulation, corruption, and collapse. The survival of freedom depends not on armies or wealth, but on minds willing to question and seek truth. Without that courage, the brightest societies can fall into darkness. The challenge is clear. Will people continue to let comfort and fear silence their thoughts, or will they reclaim the discipline of critical thinking? The answer lies not in distant institutions, but in daily choices made by individuals. Each time a person chooses curiosity over silence, truth over convenience, and courage over fear, they push back against ignorance. Each small act of thought becomes a defense against the idols that seek unquestioned loyalty. And perhaps, if enough people choose to think, the death of critical thinking may not be the end of the story, but the beginning of its rebirth. The consequences of surrendering critical thinking to ignorance and idolatry are devastating both individually and collectively. At the personal level, a person who does not question, reflect, or analyze gradually becomes vulnerable to manipulation. Without the ability to filter truth from lies, they accept whatever narrative feels most comfortable or most popular. This vulnerability shapes every area of life. Choices about health, career, relationships, and even morality can be built on illusions rather than reality. Such a life may look stable on the surface, but beneath it lies a foundation too weak to withstand challenges. When the idol fails, or the illusion breaks, the person collapses with it, unable to rebuild because their ability to think independently was never nurtured. On a broader level, societies that neglect critical thinking pay an even heavier price. History offers countless examples of nations that descended into corruption, tyranny, or chaos because citizens refused to question authority. Blind loyalty to leaders, ideologies, or movements often leads to disasters that could have been prevented if people had spoken up earlier. Idolatry transforms leaders into untouchable figures, allowing them to act without accountability. Ignorance spreads like a disease, infecting communities until lies are accepted as truth. Once this happens, injustice thrives because no one dares to expose it. Societies that silence critical thought may survive for a time, but they lose the strength to adapt, innovate, or recover when crises strike. At the psychological level, the damage is equally severe. A mind that avoids questioning becomes restless and anxious. Deep inside, people sense that something is wrong, but because they lack the tools of reflection, they cannot identify the source of their unease. This creates frustration and anger, which often get misdirected towards scapegoats rather than the real issues. People lash out at those who disagree with them, not because their beliefs are strong, but because their beliefs are fragile. When identity is built on idols, criticism feels like a personal attack. This is why debates often become hostile instead of constructive. The inability to handle disagreement is one of the clearest signs of a society where critical thinking is dying. Another cost is the loss of dialogue. True dialogue requires openness, respect, and curiosity, but ignorance and idolatry replace these with hostility and pride. Instead of conversations, we see shouting matches. Instead of debates that search for truth, we see battles where each side defends its idol. The purpose is no longer to learn or to grow, but to win, to prove loyalty, and to silence the other. This erosion of dialogue prevents communities from solving problems together. It deepens divisions, turning neighbors into enemies and differences into barriers. Without dialogue, societies cannot heal, and without healing, they eventually break apart. The weakening of critical thought also limits creativity and progress. Every discovery, every innovation, and every breakthrough in history has come from those who refused to accept things as they were. Science, art, and philosophy all thrive on the courage to challenge accepted truths. But when conformity replaces curiosity, when idols replace ideas, creativity withers. People become imitators instead of innovators, followers instead of explorers. A culture that kills critical thinking also kills its future, because it denies the very force that drives growth and discovery. Perhaps the most tragic cost of all is the loss of freedom. True freedom is not simply the absence of chains. It is the ability to think and choose for oneself. When people stop questioning, they unknowingly place themselves in mental chains, allowing others to control their perceptions and decisions. They may feel free because they are not physically restrained, but their minds are enslaved by idols and illusions. This false sense of freedom is dangerous because it blinds people to their captivity. They defend their chains, celebrate their ignorance, and attack anyone who threatens the idols they serve. And yet, despite the weight of these consequences, the story does not have to end in despair. Recognizing the cost of ignorance and idolatry is the first step toward change. Once people see how much they have lost, they may begin to value what they still have, the ability to think, however faint it may feel. Even a single question honestly asked has the power to crack the walls of illusion. The habit of questioning can be rebuilt one step at a time, through curiosity, reflection, and dialogue. The cost of blindness is high, but the reward of awakening is even greater. It brings clarity where there was confusion, strength where there was weakness, and freedom where there was dependence. The challenge is whether people will accept the cost of staying blind, or whether they will embrace the courage to see. The rebirth of the mind begins the moment a person decides to value truth over comfort. It does not require extraordinary intelligence or advanced education. It requires courage. Courage to admit ignorance, courage to challenge idols, and courage to seek answers that may not always be pleasant. Critical thinking is not about destroying beliefs or living in constant doubt, but about building a stronger foundation for understanding. It is about asking honest questions, weighing evidence, and refusing to accept something simply because it is popular or convenient. The power of the mind is awakened when curiosity replaces fear, when reflection replaces passivity, and when truth becomes more important than approval. The first step in reviving critical thinking is the simple act of asking why. This question has shaped every great discovery in history. Children are naturally full of this question, but many lose it as they grow older because they are taught that asking too much is disruptive. To recover critical thought, one must learn to ask again, without shame or hesitation. Why do I believe this? Why does this system function the way it does? Why is this leader or figure trusted without evidence? The willingness to ask why reopens the door to reflection and guards against blind acceptance. The second step is to seek evidence instead of authority. In a world filled with noise, it is easy to confuse loud voices with truth. Leaders, celebrities, and influencers may speak with confidence, but confidence is not proof. A critical mind looks for evidence that can be tested, not just words that sound persuasive. This does not mean distrusting everything, but it does mean resisting the temptation to believe something simply because it comes from someone admired or powerful. Truth does not depend on personalities. It depends on facts. The third step is to learn how to disagree respectfully. One reason people fear critical thinking is that it often leads to conflict. Disagreement, however, is not something to fear, but something to practice. A society without disagreement is a society without progress. The goal is not to win every argument, but to exchange perspectives and uncover truth together. Respectful disagreement allows individuals to test their ideas, refine their reasoning, and discover blind spots. It also prevents the hostility and division that ignorance and idolatry create. Another essential part of rebuilding the mind is humility. Critical thinking is not about proving superiority, but about admitting limits. No one has all the answers, and no perspective is complete. Humility allows a person to learn from others, to change their mind when presented with better evidence, and to continue growing. Without humility, thinking becomes arrogance, which is simply another form of idolatry, the worship of one's own opinions. With humility, thinking becomes a lifelong journey of discovery. The process of revival also requires patience. In a culture of instant results, deep reflection can feel slow and demanding. But critical thinking cannot be rushed. It grows through practice, through reading widely, listening carefully, and reflecting deeply. The more it is exercised, the stronger it becomes. Just as physical strength is built over time through discipline, mental strength is built through consistent questioning and reflection. The benefits of this rebirth are profound. A person who thinks critically is less likely to be manipulated, more capable of making wise decisions, and better prepared to face uncertainty. They find freedom in knowing that their beliefs are tested and chosen, not inherited blindly. They build resilience because when idols fall, their foundation remains strong. They are able to engage in dialogue without fear because they value truth over pride. And perhaps most importantly, they become examples to others, showing that independent thought is possible even in a world that discourages it. The rebirth of the mind is not only an individual task, but a collective one. When communities encourage questioning, when schools teach curiosity instead of memorization, when societies value dialogue instead of blind loyalty, the culture itself begins to change. This transformation will not happen overnight, but it begins with individuals willing to take the first step. Each question asked, each illusion challenged, and each truth defended adds strength to the shared life of a community. Ignorance and idolatry thrive in silence, but they weaken when even a few voices choose to think. The rebirth of the mind begins not with a revolution of violence, but with a revolution of thought. One mind at a time, one question at a time, truth can rise again. The choice lies in the hands of every individual, to remain asleep in the comfort of idols, or to awaken to the courage of thinking. Those who choose awakening not only free themselves, but help light the way for others, proving that even in a world drowning in noise, the voice of truth can still be heard. The final step in this exploration is not merely about rejecting ignorance or dismantling idols, but about creating a new way of living in which critical thought becomes as natural as breathing. The death of critical thinking has shown us the dangers of surrendering the mind, but the rebirth of it reveals the immense possibility of reclaiming freedom. To think critically is to live awake, to refuse the comfortable illusions that others hand to us, and to discover that truth is not a possession, but a pursuit. It is a discipline that never ends, because the questions never end, and it is in the questioning that human beings find both meaning and strength. When we imagine a future shaped by awakened minds, we see something very different from the world dominated by idolatry and blind conformity. In such a future, individuals would no longer be prisoners of slogans or servants of authority. They would be active participants in truth, shaping societies that value integrity over image, substance over spectacle, and dialogue over division. This is not a utopia. It is simply a possibility that arises whenever enough people choose to reclaim their minds. The death of critical thinking may have defined much of the present, but its rebirth can define the future. What makes this vision difficult is that the responsibility lies with every individual. It is tempting to wait for leaders to change, for systems to reform themselves, or for society to awaken on its own. But ignorance spreads when individuals wait, and idols grow stronger when people remain passive. The real transformation begins with a single decision: to refuse to live as a passive consumer of ideas and to choose instead to become a seeker of truth. This choice may seem small, but its effects ripple outward. A single voice asking uncomfortable questions can inspire others to do the same. A single act of courage in rejecting falsehood can weaken the power of idols. There is also a profound personal reward for this journey. To think critically is to rediscover one's own dignity. It means no longer being swayed by manipulation, no longer fearing disapproval, and no longer depending on external